My billionaire father left my sister mansions, cars, and millions. I got a cheap plastic pen. She laughed until I clicked it 3 times. Now she's begging me to trade, offering everything she inherited plus her own savings. What could possibly be inside this pen? I still remember the smell of that lawyer's office, old leather and disappointment. Dad had been gone for 3 weeks, and here we were, my sister Emma and me, sitting in these ridiculous chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The whole thing felt like a bad movie scene, you know? One of those melodramas where families tear each other apart over money. Mr. Harrison, Dad's lawyer for 20-something years, cleared his throat like he was about to announce the lottery numbers. He'd known us since we were kids, back when Emma used to steal my Halloween candy and I'd retaliate by putting spiders in her school bag. Now we could barely look at each other across this mahogany table that screamed serious business. The reading started predictably enough. Dad's house, the 3-bedroom semi where we'd grown up, where Mom had tended her roses until cancer took her, went straight to Emma. Makes sense, right? She'd been the one checking on him every Sunday, bringing him groceries, dealing with his doctor appointments, while I was building my career 200 miles away in Manchester. Then came the savings account. £23,000. All hers. The company shares from the small electrical business Dad had sold 5 years back, Emma again. I watched her face stay perfectly neutral, like she was listening to the weather forecast instead of becoming significantly wealthier by the minute. But here's where it gets weird. Dad had always been fair with us growing up. Same pocket money, same Christmas presents, same curfew times. He'd split everything down the middle our entire lives, even arguing with restaurant servers to make sure our ice cream scoops were identical. This felt completely out of character. Mr. Harrison reached for a small manila envelope with my name written in Dad's careful handwriting. The envelope was thin, really thin, like suspiciously thin for someone who'd just watched their sister inherit what looked like everything valuable our family owned. Inside was a fountain pen. That's it. One fountain pen, wrapped in tissue paper like it was some priceless artifact. No letter explaining his choices. No heartfelt note about memories or love. Just this heavy brass pen with scratched initials on the cap, WTH. For William Thomas Harper, my dad's full name that nobody ever used except government forms and apparently inheritance documents. The pen felt substantial in my hands, heavier than modern ones. The brass had developed this greenish patina that made it look ancient, like something you'd find in a museum display about Victorian writing instruments. The nib was slightly bent, probably from decades of Dad's heavy-handed signature on invoices and birthday cards. Emma glanced over at me, and I caught something in her expression, not smugness exactly, but maybe relief, like she'd been expecting me to cause a scene. Well, she was wrong. I smiled and nodded, playing the part of the gracious younger brother who totally understood why his inheritance could fit in his jacket pocket. Mr. Harrison wrapped things up with some legal jargon about probate and tax implications that went straight over my head. Emma would handle everything, naturally. She'd been handling everything Dad-related for years while I sent occasional text messages and showed up for birthdays when work allowed. The drive home was torture. 3 hours of motorway stretching ahead of me, nothing but time to think about what had just happened. I kept glancing at the pen sitting in my passenger seat, still wrapped in its tissue paper like some consolation prize from a carnival game nobody wanted to play. Part of me wondered if this was Dad's final judgment on my choices. Maybe he saw my move to Manchester as abandonment. Maybe those missed Sunday dinners and shortened Christmas visits had added up to something bigger in his mind. Maybe this pen was his way of saying I'd chosen my career over family, so why should I benefit from the family I'd left behind? Then there's the practical side that kept nagging at me during those long motorway miles. Emma had gotten a house worth at least £200,000 in today's market, plus enough cash to renovate it completely, plus ongoing income from those company shares. I'd gotten a pen that probably wouldn't sell for 20 quid at a car boot sale. By the time I pulled into my driveway in Manchester, I'd convinced myself there had to be more to this story. Dad wasn't cruel or vindictive. He'd been methodical, thoughtful, the kind of man who labeled his tool drawers and kept receipts organized by year. This pen meant something. It had to. What I didn't realize yet was just how much that scratched piece of brass was about to change everything I thought I knew about our family. The pen felt heavier than it should have when I got home that night, not physically heavy, just weighted with something I couldn't name yet. Dad's handwriting was all over that house, but he'd left me this beaten-up old fountain pen with scratched initials on the cap. What was I supposed to do with that? Frame it? I kept turning it over in my hands, feeling the brass warm up under my fingers. The nib was bent at an odd angle, like someone had dropped it or pressed too hard while writing something important. Maybe Dad's final grocery list, maybe a letter he never sent. The whole thing felt like a cruel joke, honestly. Then curiosity got the better of me. It always does. I unscrewed the barrel to see if there was any ink left inside. The cartridge was bone dry, which figured, but there was something else in there. A tiny piece of paper, folded so small it looked like confetti. My heart did this weird little skip as I pulled it out with my fingernails. The paper was yellowed and fragile, like it had been hiding in that pen for years. I unfolded it carefully, half expecting it to crumble. What I found made absolutely no sense at first. It was a pawn ticket. You know those little receipts they give you when you trade something for quick cash? The kind desperate people get when they're stuck. But here's the weird part. The date was from 1998, 25 years ago. The year Mom died. The address was for some pawn shop across town that I'd never heard of. The item description just said fountain pen, brass engraved. Dad had pawned this exact pen I was holding. My brain started spinning. Why would Dad pawn a pen? And why keep the ticket all these years? Most people throw those things away once they get their stuff back. But Dad tucked it inside the pen itself, like some kind of time capsule message. Makes sense, right? Hide the evidence where no one would think to look. The ticket was faded, but I could still make out the details. Item number 4847. Date received March 15, 1998. That was about 2 months after Mom's funeral. I remember that spring being brutal for all of us. Remember that spring being brutal for all of us. Dad was working double shifts. My sister was trying to manage the house, and I was drowning in my A-levels. Money was tight, tighter than Dad ever let on. Well, that explains the mysterious inheritance, doesn't it? While my sister got the house and the savings account, I got the pen with the secret. Dad's little breadcrumb trail for me to follow. But follow it where, and why me instead of her? I sat there staring at that ticket until my eyes went blurry. The pawn shop address was in the old part of town, near the docks where Dad used to take us fishing when we were kids. I hadn't been down that way in years. Half the shops were probably closed or turned into trendy coffee places by now. The amount on the ticket was £40. Not exactly life-changing money, but in 1998 that could cover a week's groceries or a month of bus fare. The kind of cash you need when you're scrambling to keep everything together after losing your wife. After losing the person who managed all the bills and knew where every penny went. But Dad had redeemed it. That much was obvious since I was holding the pen. So he'd gotten it back somehow. Scraped together the money plus whatever interest they charged. That meant this pen was important enough to sacrifice for, then important enough to buy back. Important enough to hide the evidence of that sacrifice inside the thing itself. The more I thought about it, the more questions piled up. What else had Dad sold that spring? What else had he quietly sacrificed while pretending everything was fine? I remembered him being tired all the time, working late, missing dinner more often than usual. We just assumed it was grief. Maybe it was survival. And why hide this story in a pen he was giving to me? What was I supposed to do with this information? Confront him about financial struggles from decades ago? Except I couldn't confront him about anything anymore. That ship had sailed along with his last breath. My sister got the explanations, the bank statements, the clear picture of Dad's final years. I got a mystery wrapped in brass and gilt. A pawn ticket from our worst year, tucked away like a confession he couldn't say out loud. There was only one way to get answers. I needed to find that pawn shop and hope someone still remembered a man desperate enough to trade his pen for grocery money. We hadn't spoken much since Mom's funeral. That's the brutal truth I keep trying to dodge. But there it is, sitting in my chest like a stone. My sister Emma managed Dad's care while I moved cities for work, chasing promotions and pretending distance was just geography. But Emma saw right through that garbage. The last real conversation we had was 3 months ago. I called to ask about Dad's medication schedule, trying to sound involved from 200 miles away. Emma's voice went flat the moment she heard mine. "You chose distance, Michael," she said, and I could practically feel her rolling her eyes through the phone. "Don't pretend you care about his pills when you can't even visit on weekends." Then she shut the door. Not literally, obviously, but you know that sound when someone hangs up and you're left holding a dead phone? That's what our relationship became. Dead air. The worst part is she wasn't wrong. I did choose distance. After Mom died, Dad became this fragile thing I didn't know how to handle. He'd call me crying at midnight, asking why Mom's perfume still lingered in their bedroom. How do you answer that? I was 26 and completely useless at grief counseling. Moving to Manchester felt like survival, not abandonment, but try explaining that to someone who stayed behind and did the hard work. Emma handled everything. Doctor appointments, grocery shopping, those awful conversations about whether Dad should give up driving. She took unpaid leave from her teaching job twice when he had pneumonia. Meanwhile, I sent birthday cards and called on Christmas, acting like that made us even. But here's what really gets me: siblings fight over estates in nearly half of cases in the UK. I looked that up after the lawyer's office, trying to make myself feel normal. Turns out family warfare over dead people's money is practically a national sport. The statistics are brutal. Brothers and sisters who grew up sharing cereal bowls end up hiring solicitors to fight over garden sheds and jewelry boxes. Most of these fights aren't even about the money, though. They're about years of resentment dressed up as inheritance disputes. The sister who changed Mom's bedpans gets furious when the brother who sent flowers gets equal shares. Makes sense, right? All those sleepless nights and canceled holidays don't add up to nothing when the will gets read. The thing is, I kept wondering what Dad saw that I kept missing. Why give Emma everything substantial and leave me with one bent pen? Was it punishment for my geographic cowardice, or was there something else buried in that decision? Emma probably thought she had it figured out. Dad rewarded loyalty and punished my escape act. Clean narrative, easy to understand. But something about that felt too simple, even for our family's drama. I remember one conversation from last Christmas when I actually made it home for 3 days. Dad was sitting in his chair, the same ratty recliner he'd had since I was 10, and he looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. "You know, Michael," he said, stirring his tea with unusual concentration, "sometimes the hardest thing isn't staying. Sometimes it's knowing when to leave." At the time, I thought he was talking about Mom, how he should have taken her to specialists sooner, maybe moved somewhere with better hospitals. But now, holding that fountain pen and thinking about Emma's anger, I wondered if he meant something different entirely. The guilt was eating me alive, though. Every phone call I didn't make, every weekend I spent hiking in the Peak District instead of driving home, every excuse about work deadlines and social commitments. Emma collected all of it like evidence for a prosecution case. Well, she had plenty of material. Dad's last 2 years were a slow slide, and I watched most of it from a distance. Emma sent updates via text because actual conversations had become too loaded with unspoken accusations. Dad fell again today. Hospital says his heart is weaker. Social worker thinks he needs more help. I'd respond with concerned emojis and offers to help that we both knew I wouldn't follow through on. The worst kind of performance, really. Enough to ease my conscience, but not enough to actually matter. And the weird part is, Dad never complained about my absence. Emma would be listing all the ways I disappointed the family, and Dad would just shrug and say, "Michael's got his own life to live," which somehow made everything worse than if he'd been angry. But that pawn ticket was still tucked in my wallet, and something about 1998 kept nagging at me. There was more to this story than sibling rivalry and inheritance drama. Dad had hidden something in that pen for a reason, and I was starting to suspect the answer might change everything I thought I knew about our family's careful scorekeeping. I kept staring at that damn pen, rolling it between my fingers like it would suddenly start talking. Dad's dead, the will's been read, and here I am with a beat-up fountain pen while my sister's probably measuring curtains for the house I grew up in. But what really ate at me wasn't the money or the property. It was the silence. No letter of wishes, no sticky note tucked inside the envelope. No "Dear son, here's why I did what I did." Just this brass pen with scratched initials and a story I couldn't read. Dad was always a man of few words, but this felt cruel, like he'd taken his reasons to the grave just to mess with my head one last time. The lawyer had handed out those envelopes like he was dealing cards. Professional. Clinical. No emotion whatsoever. When I asked if there might be another document, some explanation somewhere, he just shrugged and said most people don't bother with letters of wishes anymore. "Too much trouble," he said. Like Dad's final thoughts were paperwork nobody wanted to file. Well, that's just perfect, isn't it? I started doing what any rational person does when they're spiraling. I went down internet rabbit holes about inheritance disputes. Turns out I wasn't alone in feeling completely blindsided. Most will disputes don't even start over who gets what. They start because the executor makes decisions that piss everyone off, or because nobody knows what the hell the dead person was actually thinking. Court cases over estates have more than doubled in the past decade. Doubled. Families tearing each other apart in probate court because someone left a weird will or played favorites or just couldn't be bothered to explain themselves. The average inheritance dispute costs more than most people make in a year, and it takes forever to resolve. Years of lawyers billing by the hour while families stop speaking to each other. But here's the kicker that really got to me. House prices have gone completely mental, which means inheritances are worth way more than they used to be. A modest family home that cost £30,000 in the 70s is now worth 10 times that. Suddenly everyone's fighting over serious money, not just grandma's china set. The stakes got higher, and people got nastier. Reading those statistics made my stomach twist. Is that what we were headed for? Me and my sister hiring solicitors and arguing over dad's ledger books while strangers got rich off our family drama. The thought made me sick. Then there's the whole executor thing, which nobody talks about until it's too late. My sister got appointed executor, which basically means she's in charge of everything. She decides when to sell the house, how to split the business assets, what stays and what goes. I get exactly zero say in any of it, even though half of those assets technically belong to me now. The unfairness of it hit me like a slap. Dad didn't just give her the lion's share of everything. He gave her all the power too. She could drag this process out for years if she wanted. She could make decisions I hated, and there wouldn't be much I could do about it. The will wasn't just about money, it was about control. I kept turning that pen over in my hands, and the weight of it started to feel different. Not just brass and old ink. There was something deliberate about it, something I was missing. Dad never did anything without a reason, even if his reasons made no sense to anyone else. The worst part was knowing I couldn't just pick up the phone and ask him. No more Sunday calls where he'd grunt answers to my questions. No more awkward visits where we'd sit in his kitchen drinking tea and talking about the weather because neither of us knew how to say what we actually meant. All those chances to understand him better, and I'd wasted every single one. My sister had said something at the lawyer's office that kept echoing in my head. You chose distance, like my moving away for work was some kind of betrayal. Like I was supposed to know that Dad needed me to stay close, even though he never once asked me to. How was I supposed to read his mind from 300 miles away? But sitting there with his pen, I started wondering if maybe she was right. Maybe I had chosen distance. Maybe I'd been choosing it for years without realizing it. And maybe this inheritance wasn't punishment. Maybe it was Dad's last attempt to pull me back. The pawn ticket was still folded in my wallet. Whatever Dad had pawned and bought back in 1998, whatever story that ticket told, it felt like the only real clue he'd left me. Time to stop feeling sorry for myself and start looking for answers. I stared at the address on that pawn ticket for 3 days before I finally worked up the nerve to drive there. Maybe I was being ridiculous, chasing after some mystery my dead father left behind like breadcrumbs. But what else was I supposed to do with a bent fountain pen and a 26-year-old receipt? My sister had everything that mattered, and I had questions nobody could answer. The original address led me to a nail salon with pink neon signs and the smell of acetone drifting onto the sidewalk. Great. Another dead end in what was already feeling like the world's most depressing treasure hunt. I was about to give up when the woman behind the counter mentioned the pawn shop had moved 2 streets over about 15 years ago. Same family, she said, just a bigger location. Walking into that new shop felt like stepping back in time. The walls were lined with guitars, power tools, jewelry cases filled with wedding rings people couldn't afford to keep anymore. It's funny how pawn shops are basically museums of other people's desperate moments, isn't it? I approached the counter feeling like an idiot, clutching this old pen and a faded ticket from when most people still used dial-up internet. The guy behind the counter looked maybe 40, with graying temples and hands that had clearly seen their share of manual work. I explained my situation, half expecting him to laugh me out of the store. Instead, his eyes lit up when I showed him the pen. "Holy shit," he said, then immediately apologized for swearing. "Sorry, it's just, I remember this pen. My dad told me about it." Turns out his father had run the original shop until he died in 2019. The son, Mark, had grown up hearing stories about the regulars, the unusual items, the moments that stuck with his old man over decades of dealing with people at their lowest points. And apparently, my father's story was one of those moments. "Your dad came in on a Tuesday morning in 1998, Mark said, turning the pen over in his hands like he was examining a piece of history. My father described him as this quiet guy, maybe mid-40s, wearing a work shirt with paint stains. He needed money fast for something important. School fees, my dad thought. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. School fees. 1998 was the year I was struggling with my A-levels, the year I needed extra tutoring to get into university. The year my parents somehow found money, they didn't have to hire that expensive math tutor who probably saved my academic future. But here's the thing, Mark continued, and I could tell he was enjoying this story as much as I was dreading it. Your dad came back the same afternoon. Same day. My father had barely logged the pen into the system. That's when the real punch to the gut came. Dad hadn't just redeemed the pen later, when times got better or when he could afford it. He'd pawned it in the morning, gotten whatever cash he needed, then worked some kind of miracle to get it back before the sun went down. My dad asked him why he came back so fast. Mark said, polishing the pen with a cloth like it was something precious. Most people, they take weeks, months, sometimes they never come back at all. But your father, he just smiled and said, some things you keep, even when it hurts. I had to sit down. There was a plastic chair next to the guitar section, and I dropped into it like my legs had forgotten how to work. All those years I thought Dad was just this practical man who never got sentimental about objects. He was always telling us not to get too attached to things. That stuff was just stuff. And here he was, pawning and reclaiming a fountain pen in the space of 8 hours because he couldn't bear to lose it permanently. What did he do to get the money back so quickly? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Mark shrugged. My dad didn't ask too many personal questions, bad for business. But he mentioned your father looked exhausted when he came back, like he'd been working all day. Had different clothes on, I think. Different clothes. Dad must have picked up an extra shift somewhere, maybe construction or moving work. The kind of back-breaking labor he'd done before getting his regular job. Also, I could pass calculus and get into university and never know what it cost him. Standing there in that pawn shop, surrounded by other people's abandoned treasures, I finally understood why Dad left me the pen. Not because it was valuable, but because it was proof. Proof of what he'd sacrifice, what he'd endure, how far he'd go. But that wasn't the whole story. I still had to figure out what those careful numbers in his old notebooks would tell me. Back home, my hands were still shaking from what the pawn shop owner told me. Dad pawned the pen to pay for something, then bought it back the same day. That didn't sound like Dad at all. He was careful with money, sure, but he wasn't the type to make desperate moves like that. Unless he was really stuck. I went straight to his old desk in the spare room. My sister hadn't touched it yet, probably saving that emotional minefield for later. The drawers were stuffed with his usual obsessive record-keeping, receipts sorted by year, bank statements in neat piles, and those little notebooks where he tracked every penny that came and went. Dad was old school like that. He wrote everything down by hand, never trusted computers for the important stuff. The 1998 notebooks were buried under a stack of more recent ones. God, 1998. That was the year everything fell apart. Mom had been sick for months, and I was in my final year at school, completely drowning in my A-levels. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Which it did, obviously, but that spring we were still pretending everything might work out fine. I flipped through the pages, looking for anything about the pen. Dad's handwriting was so tiny and precise, it hurt my eyes to read. Every expense logged in pencil, groceries, petrol, Mom's prescriptions that cost more each month. Then I found it, a line that made my stomach drop. Redeemed pen, paid with overtime shifts. The date matched the pawn ticket exactly, but there was more. A few lines up, another entry that made everything worse. Sold tools. Kids won't know the difference. My chest felt tight. I kept reading, going back through the weeks before that entry. The picture got clearer and uglier. Extra shifts at the factory. Weekend work when he should have been home with Mom. Small sales, his drill set, some old fishing gear, a watch I remembered him wearing when I was little. All of it adding up to one specific amount. Then I found the payment. Exam tutor, final installment. Jesus, the tutor. I'd completely forgotten about the tutor. Back then, I was failing chemistry and panicking about university applications. Dad hired some retired teacher to come around twice a week and drill equations into my thick skull. I never asked what it cost. Why would I? I was 17 and assumed money just appeared when parents needed it for important things, but apparently it didn't just appear. Dad had to pawn his father's pen, the one thing he'd kept from Granddad, to make the final payment. Then he worked extra shifts to buy it back, before I found out. Before anyone found out, the worst part, it worked. The tutor got me through chemistry. I passed my A-levels, got into university, landed the job that let me move away from all the mess at home, and I never knew Dad had literally sold his tools to make it happen. I sat there staring at those tiny pencil numbers, feeling like the world's biggest idiot. All those years thinking Dad was just being cheap when he wouldn't buy new things for himself. All those times I rolled my eyes at his careful spending, his refusal to splash out on anything fun. He wasn't being tight. He was making sure there was enough for what mattered. For us. For me. There were other entries scattered through those months. Reduced grocery budget. Postponed car service. Canceled newspaper subscription. Little sacrifices I never noticed because he made sure I never had to notice them. While Mom was dying and I was stressing about exams, Dad was quietly dismantling his own life piece by piece to keep ours intact. The really twisted thing is how angry I was at him for years after Mom died. Angry that he didn't seem to grieve properly, didn't fall apart like I thought he should. Angry that he just kept working, kept managing, kept solving problems without making a big deal about it. I thought it meant he didn't care enough. Turns out it meant he cared too much to let everything collapse. I carefully tore out the page with the pen entry. My sister needed to see this. We both needed to understand what Dad was actually leaving us. Not just money and property, but a record of how far he'd go to take care of us. Even when it meant giving up the things that mattered most to him. The pen felt heavier in my pocket as I walked to the car. Maybe that weight wasn't just brass and old ink. Maybe it was the weight of everything Dad never told us he'd done. Everything he'd sacrificed without expecting thanks or even recognition. Time to show my sister what our inheritance really meant. Walking to my sister's house felt like carrying a bomb in my pocket. The notebooks were tucked under my arm, and that damn pen was burning a hole through my jacket. I hadn't called ahead because honestly, what was I supposed to say? Hey Sarah, turns out Dad wasn't playing favorites after all, he was just really bad at explaining himself. She answered the door in her pajamas at 2 in the afternoon, which should have been my first clue that she wasn't doing great either. Her hair was in one of those messy buns that screams, I haven't left the house in 3 days, and there were dark circles under her eyes that made her look older than our mother ever did. Makes sense, right? She'd been carrying this weight alone, while I was busy feeling sorry for myself. What do you want? She asked, not even trying to hide the exhaustion in her voice. But she stepped aside anyway, which I took as progress. Her kitchen looked like a paper bomb had exploded. Bills everywhere, folders stacked on the counter, Dad's old checkbook open next to a calculator with numbers that made my stomach drop. I pulled out the notebooks first. I found these in Dad's study. She glanced at them and shrugged. More of his obsessive record keeping. What's new? The defensiveness was still there, thick as concrete between us. But when I opened to 1998 and pointed to that line about the pen, something shifted in her expression. She actually sat down, which was more than I'd expected. Read it, I said, sliding the book across her cluttered table. She read it once silently, then out loud, redeemed pen. Paid with overtime shifts. Her voice caught on the last word, and I realized this was the first time either of us had really considered what those overtime shifts meant. Dad working doubles at the factory while we slept, coming home with grease under his fingernails and that tired smile he always wore. Then there was the next line, the one that made everything click into place like a puzzle piece you'd been holding upside down. Sold tools. Kids won't know the difference. Sarah's face went white. He sold his tools. Dad loved those tools more than anything except us. Maybe more than us on bad days. His workshop was sacred space, and those tools were extensions of his hands. He'd rather have cut off a finger than sold them. Well, apparently not. The pen paid for my exam tutor that spring, I said quietly. I never knew where the money came from. She was quiet for a long time, tracing the faded pencil marks with her finger. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, like the walls were pressing in on our shared guilt, because that's what it was, wasn't it? Guilt that we'd been too young and selfish to notice the sacrifices. But why was I expecting some magical reconciliation moment? Sarah looked up at me with something harder than forgiveness in her eyes. You want to know what he gave me? She grabbed a manila folder from the pile and dumped it in front of me. Care invoices, hundreds of them. Night nurse bills, medication receipts, doctor visits that went on for pages. He gave you the pen. He gave me the bills. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of pounds over 5 years of his declining health, And there, at the bottom of each invoice, Sarah's signature as guarantor. I had to remortgage my flat twice, she continued, her voice steady but brittle. Turned down 2 job promotions because I couldn't travel. Broke up with James because he got tired of canceled dates every time Dad had another episode. The weight of it hit me like a punch to the chest. While I was building my career 3 cities away, she was drowning in responsibility I'd never even asked about. And the weird part is, I'd always assumed Dad's care was just handled, like it happened by magic or government programs or something equally naive. I didn't know, I said, which sounded pathetic even to me, because you didn't want to know. That stung because it was probably true. Distance had been easier than dealing with the reality of Dad getting older, frailer, more dependent. I'd sent money occasionally, sure, but money from far away doesn't sit with someone in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning. Sarah was staring at the notebook again, and when she looked up, something had shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe understanding. He gave you the pen because he wanted you to remember the sacrifice, she said slowly. He gave me everything else because he knew I'd already lived it. We sat there surrounded by the evidence of our father's complicated love, and I realized this conversation was just the beginning. There were bigger decisions ahead, harder truths to face. But first we needed to figure out what came next. My hands were shaking when I uncapped that fountain pen. Not from nerves exactly, but from something heavier. The weight of understanding, maybe. The weight of finally getting what Dad had been trying to tell me all along. The paper felt important under my fingers. Official. Final. I pressed the nib down and watched the blue ink flow across the signature line of the share release form. My name looked different in that old pen's handwriting. Steadier somehow, like Dad was guiding my hand from wherever he'd gone. Sarah watched me sign away my claim to the house, the savings, all of it. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there with her tea getting cold. Then she slid another set of papers across the kitchen table. Consultant agreement, she said quietly, for Dad's shop. 20% of profits, and you help me decide what to keep, what to change. Well, that caught me off guard. I'd been prepared for a clean break, for walking away with just the pen and whatever dignity I had left. But this felt like Dad's doing again. Even dead, the man was still trying to keep his family together. The weird part is, I actually laughed. Right there in Sarah's kitchen, with all our old wounds still bleeding a bit. I laughed. He's still managing us, isn't he? Still pulling strings from beyond the grave. Sarah smiled for the first time in months. A real smile, not one of those polite funeral smiles we'd been trading. You know what he used to say about the shop? It's not about the tools, it's about what people build with them. I think he meant more than just hammers and screwdrivers. Makes sense, right? Dad never did anything without 3 layers of meaning buried underneath. The pen wasn't just a pen, the will wasn't just about money. Even this mess we'd made of being siblings wasn't really about who got what. We spent the next hour going through Dad's plans for the shop. Expansion ideas he'd sketched out, supplier contacts he'd been nurturing, even a half-finished website design on his ancient computer. The man had been 73 and trying to figure out social media marketing. I had to give him credit for effort. He talked about you a lot, Sarah said, scrolling through Dad's notes, especially after you got promoted to regional manager. Said you understood business better than he ever did. She paused, looking at me sideways. Said I understood people better, but you understood systems. That hit me harder than I expected. All those years thinking he was disappointed in my choices, thinking he saw my distance as abandonment. Turns out he was just waiting for the right moment to pull us back together. Typical Dad, really. Never direct when indirect would do. But why did it have to take his death to get us here? Why couldn't we have figured this out while he was still around to see it work? I kept thinking about all those Sundays I could have visited, all those phone calls I cut short, because I was busy with work, with life, with everything except the people who actually mattered. Then there is the bitter irony of it all. I spent years climbing corporate ladders, chasing promotions, building a career that took me further and further from home. Now here I was, signing papers to become a partner in Dad's small-town hardware shop, the same shop I couldn't wait to escape when I was 18. Sarah framed Dad's ledger page from 1998. The line about redeeming the pen, about choosing overtime shifts over keeping his tools, we hung it behind the shop counter, right where customers could see it. Not because we wanted to advertise our family drama, but because it reminded us what matters, what you keep, what you let go, what you sacrifice for the people you love. The pen sits on my desk now, in my apartment that suddenly feels too empty, too far from everything important. I use it to sign contracts, write notes, mark calendar dates for shop visits. Every time I uncap it, I think about Dad's hands holding it, about the weight he carried, about the choices he made when nobody was watching. Not everything we inherit is money or property or things you can put a price tag on. Sometimes what gets passed down is heavier than that. Sometimes it's the understanding that love looks different than you thought it did. Sometimes it's the realization that the people who matter most are the ones who stick around when sticking around is hard. The shop reopens next month. Sarah's handling day-to-day operations. I'm managing the books and expansion plans. We're keeping Dad's name on the sign, but adding "and daughters" underneath. He would have gotten a kick out of that. Always did appreciate a good plot twist.